Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Digital Hammurabi. Thank you for joining us on this, for me, very sunny Wednesday morning. Today, I am delighted to have Andrew Lawler here. Andrew is a journalist and author, and he is here to talk to us about his brand new publication, Under Jerusalem. And if that's not the most beautiful book cover you've seen in a while, I don't know what is. So, Andrew, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Megan. What a pleasure. Having always been a big fan of Mesopotamia, I particularly enjoy Digital Hammurabi. So if you like, you want me to tell you a little bit about myself and before we get into the book, would that be helpful?
That would be beautiful. Thank you.
Great. So I've been writing about archaeology for about 20 years or so. I first went to Baghdad for a conference on 5,000 years of writing back in, I guess it was in 2000. Even before the Iraq War, and got very interested in what people were learning in that time about how cities developed, how civilizations came about, both in Egypt and Mesopotamia. And of course, between Egypt and Mesopotamia, you've got the Middle East, you've got the Near East, and Jerusalem, which is about 5,000 years old. And I really gave Jerusalem a bit of a wide berth because so many politics, so much religion, so complicated. When I was interested in writing about the ancient world, I just tried to steer clear of that place. But that all began to change a few years ago when I made a visit there for a conference and got taken down below the street level in Jerusalem. And that launched me into this crazy project.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I have to say, I've never been to Jerusalem, but it sounds like a fascinating place, especially archaeologically speaking. So I'm a little bit jealous that you had that experience.
So you can always read the book.
Well, I mean, that is the plan. That is the plan. And as you know, and as longstanding viewers know, I have an awful lot of waking hours on my hands at the moment because of the twins. So maybe this will be my new midnight project when they refuse to sleep. So what made you decide to start researching the archaeology and history of Jerusalem?
Well, as I mentioned, I'd gone to Jerusalem for a conference and was invited by an archaeologist, Israel Finkelstein, to go visit these underground sites, many of which are not open to the public. And I thought we would just have a nice lunch and take a stroll. Next thing I know, 6 hours has gone by, and we had visited all these sites and met all these archaeologists. And I realized this is way more interesting than I had suspected. And what was particularly interesting was that as we were walking through these tunnels and through these trenches, continuously these archaeologists would point out these tunnels and old trenches. They say, oh, well, this was done by Charles Warren back in the 19th century, or, oh, Bliss and Dickey were here, all these names I wasn't familiar with. And so when I got back home, I started to read up and I realized, wow, archaeology in Jerusalem has this quite a long history, 150 years, really in the 1860s when it began. And so I began to piece together the history of these people. And although much has been written about those early years, nobody had really written about the whole history of archaeology, if you will, of Jerusalem from the beginning in 1863 up into the present day. So that's when I realized that I could create a kind of timeline of how archaeology developed and how it was used or misused, and what it had found, and put it all together into a single place, a single book.
Was it difficult to synthesize all that information, or did it fit together relatively neatly?
There is nothing neat about Jerusalem. It's a messy place in many ways. But there were some distinct periods. So obviously, the beginning is the first dig, which was in 1863 by Félicien de Zozy, who was a French senator and military officer. And he went and he dug the Tomb of the Kings, which is Jerusalem's grandest tomb. And he brought back to the Louvre a sarcophagus that was filled with the remains of clearly a royal woman. He declared this to be the Queen of Hezekiah, of King Hezekiah. So he declared this to be a Jewish queen, a Judean queen from biblical times. This made a big sensation in Europe. People could go to the Louvre and for the first time see biblical artifacts. And that in turn sparked outrage from the Jewish community, which said, you are robbing our grave. Here's a French Catholic going and digging up our Jewish ancestors. So from the beginning, archaeology in Jerusalem was fraught. And that was kind of the first period. And then it was in the second period, you have the British who take over Jerusalem in 1917. And then, of course, 1967 is when the Israelis conquered Jerusalem, all of Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, and for the first time had access to the Holy City. So you have some distinct errors which allowed me to kind of piece things together in a way that made sense.
Mm-hmm. And that actually kind of leads a little bit onto the next question. Could you maybe talk a little bit more about how the city of Jerusalem has been kind of claimed and co-opted by different groups throughout its history?
Right. Well, and I'll focus on the archaeology here. So the archaeology that began in the 1860s was a time before, of course, archaeology was really a science. It was more exploration. Mostly these were wealthy white guys from Europe who showed up. There were diplomats, missionaries, military officers, people who weren't trained formally in archaeology because it wasn't really a formal discipline. But they began to dig not to find, not to make the kind of scientific discoveries we think of today, but to find treasure and also to find, as I mentioned before, the remains from the Bible. So really, these are Western Christians who showed up in Jerusalem, which at that point was controlled by the Ottomans, the Ottoman Empire based in Istanbul. And they got dig permits from the Ottomans to dig beneath Jerusalem. And their goal was to find the biblical Jerusalem that lay below the streets. And that was really their motivation. In a way, they wanted to use science to prove the Bible, to prove that what was written in Scripture was in fact true. So it's a really interesting case of science being used to bolster faith, because this is a time of Darwin, the origin of species, geologists are questioning Genesis. So a lot of Western Christians were worried that Christianity was beginning to kind of lose its grip, and archaeology in Jerusalem offered a way to counter that.
Fascinating. Thank you. Oh, sorry. We have a little bit of an echo. Oh, no, it's gone. There we go. Sorry. I could hear myself speaking back through your speakers. So for people watching, just a quick reminder, we will be taking some audience questions at the end of my conversation with Andrew. So if you do have questions, please put them in the chat. Make sure you tag me at Digital Hammurabi, and we will get to them relatively soon. And if you are interested in purchasing Under Jerusalem, there is a link in the chat, and I will be putting another link in the description of this video. Highly recommended. I think it well, apart from anything else, has some stellar reviews from people like Eric Klein, who, frankly, if Eric Klein is reviewing your work positively, it's something that you should then be going and reading. So purchase it, read it, enjoy it. Okay, now I've done that little plug. So what was your maybe most surprising discovery when you were doing research for this book?
What really amazed me was to unpack the origins of archaeology in Jerusalem. That people talk a lot about the history of Jerusalem, but not really much has been written about how archaeology got started. And I was surprised to find out that, as we talked about before, that it was Western Christians who arrived and made Jerusalem a place that people wanted to go to, because of their finds, tourists began to stream into Jerusalem. There was more to see. You could go underground, you could visit these sites. It was very exciting. Newspaper people, magazine people came. Patrons of the arts came, and it was a popular place to visit. Mark Twain was one of the first American tourists to go in the 1860s, at the same time as Charles Warren, the great British archaeologist, was digging underground there in Jerusalem. So it was archaeology that, in a sense, helped to create the Western tourism for Jerusalem, which then increased the desire for Western powers to control Jerusalem. Because at that point, the Ottoman Empire was beginning to fray at the edges, and the European powers were eager to pick up the pieces. And Jerusalem was a key piece of the Ottoman Empire that every Western power, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, were all seeking to control. So what surprised me was finding out that archaeology was linked to this political attempt to colonize and control Jerusalem long before there was Jewish interest in going to Jerusalem. And so this archaeology, mainly by Western Protestants, is what helped inspire Jewish groups in Europe to become Zionists, to create this concept of Zionism, which in turn led to the formation of the state of Israel. So I think it's a really unique case where archaeology played a critical role in very important, you could argue, some of the most important political developments of modern times.
I had no idea that archaeology was quite that influential in the history of the region. That is fascinating. Thank you. So kind of on top of that, and that might be the same answer, but what's your favorite story or piece of information in the book?
Oh, well, hands down, it's the man named Montague Brownlow Parker, who was a British aristocrat who at the turn of the last century, around 1911, hooked up with this Finnish poet and theologian and mystic who believed that he had cracked the code in the Bible that said where the Ark of the Covenant and the temple treasures of the Temple of Solomon were hidden. And it's the zaniest, weirdest archaeological expedition in history. And when I use the word archaeological, I put those in quotes because they had this massive expedition, including they had a cricket player, they had a man who worked as a captain on a steamboat on the Congo River for the Belgians. There was a Swiss psychic, but they forgot to hire an archaeologist.
I know they had their bases covered because they had the Swiss psychic. I think from now on, all archaeological expeditions should include a psychic.
And the psychic and the Finnish mystic, they were constantly fighting with each other over where they believe the temple treasures were. So they started to dig, and of course they found nothing of interest. They dug tunnels everywhere. And then at the very end, Parker became worried that they were going to find nothing and his investors were going to be furious. He bribed the guard at the Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary or Temple Mount to Jews, and went in at night and began to hammer away at the very rock underneath the Dome of the Rock. Of course, he was discovered and chased out of town. He's lucky he got away with his life. And this has been treated a little bit as kind of a comic opera absurd thing, but it had a very important consequence, and that was that the Arab Muslims living in Jerusalem came to the conclusion that they could not trust the Ottomans to protect what was Islam's third holiest site. And so this was, according to Louis Fishman, who's he's a historian at Brooklyn College, really the beginning of Palestinian Arab nationalism that really made the Temple Mount, the noble sanctuary, the center of what would become a very hotly contested land in the 20th and, of course, into the 21st century.
Thank you. Wow. Amazing. So looking kind of towards the end of the book, what kinds of conclusions do you come to based on the work and the research that you've done? And is there maybe anything that the audience might find surprising?
Well, clearly, there is so much more to be found. I'll give you an example. I lived in the old city while I was doing my reporting in the Christian Quarter. And one day I went into my local grocery store. And the grocery store owner said, "Who are you? You're not a tourist. You've been hanging out here a long time." And I told him what I was doing. He said, "Oh, come with me." He walked to the potato chip aisle, opened a hatch, and vanished. So I put down my groceries and I followed. What else was I going to do?
Of course.
And beneath this little grocery store was this enormous hall, a vaulted Crusader-era hall that had been dug out by the monks who lived next door at the Holy Sepulchre. And it turned into a huge battle between the store owner and the monks as to who owned this very impressive, huge space, which became a chapter in my book. So it gives you an idea that there's digging going on in Jerusalem that nobody knows about, that is not the Israeli Antiquities Authority, but rather homeowners and priests and monks and anybody who's got land in Jerusalem, and they dig down, whether it's just to create a new basement or to add a room to your house or to look for treasure. It's going on all the time. So that was a bit of a surprise. And as a result, I think we may see some spectacular finds in the years to come.
That's amazing. And I wish that I could dig a basement and find a Crusader era hall. That's incredible.
Yeah. But at the same time, I think that that's a problem because this illegal digging, of course, things don't get published. The artifacts that are found are often sold on the art market, which in Israel is pretty wide open. So it really is having also a terrible effect. We're losing cultural heritage in Jerusalem because the people who live there, particularly the Muslims, the Arabs, Christians, and Muslims, don't really want to tell the Israelis what they're doing because they can get into big trouble. And there's all kinds of politics there. So unfortunately, I think we're losing a lot that will never come to light.
Mm-hmm. And were you able to get a feel for how widespread these kind of personal digs are?
Oh, all you have to do is walk through the
Literally
old
everyone.
on a Saturday morning, because that's the Jewish Sabbath, when the Israeli Antiquities Authority is not patrolling quite so carefully. And you see these bags, these white bags filled with dirt, sitting outside waiting to be picked up as trash. So there's no question that this is going on all the time, continuously. And I got to meet some people who were doing it. Some people would let me into their basement, show me what they're doing. But most people were really careful because they knew that they could face fines or even jail time or lose their homes if they're discovered doing this, because it is very illegal.
I had absolutely no idea. And obviously these are people with zero archaeological training, just kind of.
But of course, the science that's going on in Jerusalem now in those legal digs is really improving in terms of its quality. And that gives me some hope, because although archaeology has been used first by European Christians and then by Israeli Jews to kind of bolster their claim to control Jerusalem, the science that we're finding is actually goes way beyond the strict Jewish or Muslim or Christian narratives that we think of when we think of Jerusalem. So this gives me some hope that the science that's coming out of all of this will provide a broader way to see what is an incredibly fascinating city of enormous religious innovation that has played such a key role in the history of the Middle East and, of course, of the world.
Well, thank you very much for that. I'm going to go to a very quick 60-second break. Audience, if you have questions, now is the time to get them in, please. If you do not have them in by the end of the break, then Andrew and I will say goodbye and carry on with our mornings. So we will be back in 60 seconds. If you'd like an expert to answer your questions, then make sure you join us live next time. Check out digitalhammurabi.com/calendar for details of future interviews. And remember to bring your questions. And we are back. Thank you very much. We officially have no audience questions, which is bizarre, honestly. We usually manage at least one. So, Andrew, I will... Oh, no, I lie. We just got one in. That I'm not sure you'll be able to answer, so I'm very sorry. So Big Zebra says, Jerusalem means city of peace. This exceeds even my considerable appetite for irony. Can we adjust the name to not the city of peace? I think that's more of a comment than a question, Zebra, but thank you very much for your consideration.
Well, the questioner does have a good point that Jerusalem does have that reputation of being the city of peace, but of course it's one of the most, at least in historical terms, one of the most violent places we know of on earth. But I think that also is because people have this this concept of peace, which often includes meaning Jerusalem is mine and nobody else's, and so that just paves the way for conflict. Ironically, indeed.
And we have one more question from David. Was anything determined from the Queen of Josiah's sarcophagus that you mentioned earlier?
Right. Oh, great question. I'm so glad you asked this. But I've got an article coming out in Biblical Archaeology Review shortly that goes into detail about this. So just quickly, the French archaeologist de Saussy took this sarcophagus and the remains back to the Louvre. He declared it to be the queen of King Hezekiah, biblical king. Now, since then, researchers have come to a very different conclusion, and that is that no, this is actually a queen who lived in the 1st century CE, so well over 1,000 years later. and that she actually was possibly Queen Helena of Adiabene, who was a woman from Iraq who converted to Judaism, came to Jerusalem shortly after the time of Jesus. Now, in the story that I did, I'm drawing on research by a French archaeologist who lives right next to the Tomb of the Kings. And he says, no, in fact, this was probably not her, because probably this sarcophagus was buried maybe a century or two even after that. So we really don't know who this person was. And we don't know for sure even that they were Jewish. So it's really rewriting the history of what has been known as the most monumental and beautiful tomb in Jerusalem.
Interesting. Thank you. And one final question before we wrap up. Do you think the temple is accurately located, as the site features do not match the biblical account?
This is a very important question, not just archaeologically, but also from a religious and political point of view, because there are many Jewish fundamentalists and Christian fundamentalists who want to see the temple rebuilt. Now, where would it be built? Well, presumably there on the Noble Sanctuary, which is also home to the Dome of the Rock, Islam's third holiest site. So, first of all, we have no physical evidence of either the Temple of Solomon or even of Herod's temple. It simply doesn't exist. Why? Because there's been no archaeology done. Now, the texts are very clear that those structures existed, but we don't know where. Now, we have some evidence from the temple complex of the time of Herod, so around the 1st century BC. But as I say, since there's no evidence of where the temple was, and since scripture, as you mentioned, is a little bit contradictory, it doesn't really say exactly where it was located, we still don't know. But like I say, this is a very contentious question because it does get into politics, and this kind of discussion really makes Palestinian Muslims furious, because to them it's simply the first step toward demolishing the Dome of the Rock and to replace it with a Jewish temple. But right now, if that were done, there is no archaeological way of knowing where the temple was, and therefore where a new temple could possibly be sited that's related to the old ones.
Wonderful. Thank you. And like I said, we will be wrapping up here, but thank you so much. This was very interesting and illuminating. I enjoyed myself. I think the audience enjoyed themselves. And again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Megan. I appreciate your time.
Of course. Audience, thank you for joining us. Have a lovely rest of your day. And remember, until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that? Digital Hammurabi is made possible by generous sponsorship from our patrons. Their support means that we have the technological and academic resources necessary to bring the ancient world directly to you. If you want to join the team, go to patreon.com/Digital Hammurabi to see how you can help.